Rosalie Vane's voice cut through the crowded general store like a blade, loud enough to turn heads, sharp enough to draw blood. "Oh, I heard Gideon Mercer finally sent away for one." She smiled at the women gathered around the dry goods counter, her tone sweet as spoiled honey. A mail-order bride. Can you imagine? The man couldn't find a single woman in 3 counties willing to take on 7 wild boys and a half-dead ranch, so he ordered himself one like a new plow. She laughed. "I wonder what she'll last a week. 2?" Nobody corrected her. Nobody told her to stop. And that was the moment Evelyn Hart, standing just outside the open door, with her single travel bag and dust still on her boots, understood exactly what kind of life she had just stepped into. If it were you, would you have walked through that door anyway? If this story already has your attention, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel was made for. Subscribe right now so you don't miss what happens next, because this story gets a great deal more complicated before it gets better. Hit the like button and drop a comment with your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Evelyn Hart was 31 years old, which in 1884 Wyoming meant she had already outlived most people's idea of what a woman's life was supposed to look like. She had never been pretty in the way that made men stumble. She was plain in the way that made people underestimate her, which she had long since decided was more useful. She had gray-green eyes that saw more than she usually let on, hands that were already calloused from years of domestic work, and a posture that strangers often described as stubborn, though she thought of it as simply upright. She had answered Gideon Mercer's advertisement in the Wyoming Territorial Gazette because she had no better options, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it. The advertisement had been blunt, which she respected. Widower, 42, 7 sons, working cattle ranch outside Cary Springs, seeking capable woman, good health, willing to work, correspondence welcomed. No poetry, no promises. She had written back in the same tone. They had exchanged 4 letters over 6 weeks. None of the letters had contained anything resembling warmth. She had found that reassuring. The stagecoach dropped her in Cary Springs on a Tuesday morning in late September, and the first thing she did was pick up her bag before the driver could pretend to help, and then demand something for the effort. The second thing she did was ask directions to the Mercer Ranch from the man sweeping the post office steps, who gave her a look she was already beginning to recognize. The look people gave a woman traveling alone with 1 bag and no escort. The wagon Gideon had arranged was waiting at the edge of town. The driver was a boy of about 14, with hay in his hair and absolutely no interest in conversation, which suited Evelyn fine. She sat with her bag on her lap and watched the town fall away behind her, and the open land open up ahead. And she told herself the same thing she had told herself on the 3-day train ride and the long stagecoach haul before it. This is a job. You are going to do the job. You are not going to expect anything else. She had expected the ranch to be modest. She had not expected it to look quite so tired. The house was large enough, 2 stories, a wide porch that wrapped around the front and one side, a barn visible beyond the main structure, fenced pasture rolling out in 3 directions. But everything about it had the particular exhaustion of a place where nobody had stopped to care for it in a long time. The porch railing on the left side was missing 2 boards. The front steps sagged slightly to the right. The window boxes were empty and cracking. The paint on the shutters had given up entirely on the south-facing side. She noticed all of it in the time it took the wagon to roll to a stop. There were boys on the porch. She had known there would be 7 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 19. What she had not fully prepared herself for was the particular quality of silence that 7 boys could produce when they had all decided, collectively, to make a judgment. They stood or sat in a row and watched her climb down from the wagon without helping, and the silence was the kind that had an opinion inside it. The tallest one stepped forward when she reached the bottom of the porch. Steps. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, with a jaw that had recently finished deciding it was done with boyhood. He looked at her the way a man twice his age might look at a horse he suspected was lame. Wyatt Mercer, he said. He didn't offer his hand. Evelyn Hart. She didn't wait for the hand. Pause in the south pasture. He'll be back before supper, all right. He looked at her bag, then back at her face. You know there were two before you. She met his eyes. I heard. They didn't stay. I noticed you mentioned that, rather than say your name or a welcome. Something shifted in his expression, not softening. Exactly. More like recalibration. He hadn't expected pushback delivered that flatly. I'm just telling you how it is. I understand that, she said. Now tell me where the kitchen is. The kitchen was worse than she had imagined, which was saying something, because she had prepared herself for bad. The smell hit her first old grease. Something sour she didn't want to investigate immediately, and underneath it all the particular odor of a space that had been cleaned only when absolutely necessary, and not recently. The cast iron stove was filmed with grease and ash. The table had the remains of what appeared to be at least 3 meals still present on its surface. The floor hadn't been swept in days. She set her bag down just inside the doorway and stood there for a moment, not in dismay but in assessment. The way a doctor might look at a wound before deciding where to begin. Small voice said, "It's bad, huh?" She turned. The youngest boy was standing behind her. He was 6 years old and had his brother's dark hair but none of his guardedness. He was simply standing there with a candid expression, holding a biscuit that appeared to be several days old. "What's your name?" she asked. Eli. She crouched down to his level. "How long has it been like this?" He thought about it seriously, the way small children do when they want to give you a correct answer. Since Mama died. But it got worse when Mrs. Calloway left. Who was Mrs. Calloway? The second one. She absorbed that. When did she leave? Before the first frost last year. So the kitchen had been running without any real management for nearly a year. She stood back up and looked at the stove, the table, the shelves, the single small window that faced north and let in almost no light. "All right," she said, mostly to herself. "Are you going to leave too?" Eli asked. She looked down at him. He was holding his stale biscuit with both hands, and his face was carefully neutral in the way that children get when they've learned that hoping for things is dangerous. "Not today," she said, which was the most honest thing she could offer. She found Gideon Mercer at the edge of the south pasture fence, just as the light was beginning to go amber. He was repairing a section of wire with his back to her, and he didn't hear her coming until she was 10 feet away, which told her either that he was very concentrated or very tired. Turned and looked at her. He was taller than she'd expected. The photograph he'd sent had been a small and unhelpful thing taken at some distance. In person, he was lean and weathered in the way that outdoor work, created not broken down but worn to the essentials. There were lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with squinting at the sun. His hands, she noticed automatically, were the hands of a man who had not stopped working since before he could remember. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read, which she respected. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Mercer." There was a pause. Neither of them was comfortable with pleasantries, which meant neither of them wasted time on them. "I would have come to the house," he said. "I wanted to see the property, and it needs work." He didn't look offended. "Yes, kitchen needs to be stripped and started over. Pantry is nearly empty. The garden is finished for the season, but it wasn't tended this summer, so next spring we'll be planting from scratch." She had walked the perimeter before coming to find him. "The root cellar has potatoes and some dried beans and 2 jars of preserves that I think are still good. There's a ham hock that might be salvageable. I can make supper from what's there." He was looking at her with that same unreadable expression. "All right, I have some questions about the arrangement. Go ahead." "Your eldest made clear this morning that I'm the 3rd woman you've brought to this house. I'd like to know what happened with the first 2 from you, not from the boys." His jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger, she thought, but in the way of a man who isn't used to being asked direct questions. He looked out at the pasture for a moment, then back at her. "The first one came in April. She lasted 11 days. She said the boys were unmanageable and the house was too isolated. A pause. She wasn't wrong on either count. He said it without apology. The second one, Clara Calloway, stayed 5 months. She was a decent woman. She left because Wyatt made it clear enough that she wasn't welcome. And I didn't step in the way I should have. He said that last part evenly, but something in his eyes shifted when he said it, something that looked like a man who had looked at his own failures and hadn't looked away. I appreciated the honesty in your advertisement, she said. I don't have the patience for the other kind. Neither do I. She looked at him directly. I came here because I needed a situation, and you offered one. I don't expect warmth, and I'm not going to pretend I feel things I don't. But I'll work, and I'll work honestly, and I'd like to know I'm working towards something more than just outlasting the previous two. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What do you want, Miss Hart? It was a plain question. She answered it plainly. A roof that's mine. Work that's real. To be left alone to do it. He nodded. That's reasonable. Then we understand each other. They walked back to the house, in the beginning of the evening, dark, not speaking. And Evelyn thought that this was, at least, a starting point. Not a good one, but an honest one. Supper that first night was not remarkable. It was not supposed to be. She found an old ham hock in the root cellar, exactly where she'd thought it might be shriveled and dense, but not gone. She boiled it down with dried beans and a handful of salt and the better of 2 tired onions she found in a crate by the back door. It was plain food. It was the kind of food that didn't ask anything of anyone. The boys came to the table in a rough sort of order that suggested they had done this before. Once, when someone had made them. They ranged from Eli at 6 to Wyatt at 19, with 5 boys stacked in between Thomas, who was 16 and said nothing, the twins Aaron and James, 14, who talked to each other in low voices throughout the meal, Samuel, 11, who watched Evelyn with open curiosity, and Noah, 9, who had apparently decided to conduct an experiment in ignoring her completely. Gideon sat at the head of the table. He did not say grace. None of the boys seemed to expect it. Evelyn served the food herself, starting from the youngest, and sat at the far end of the table. Wyatt looked at his bowl. He picked up his spoon and then set it back down. He looked at Evelyn. Mrs. Calloway made a proper stew. Mrs. Calloway had 5 months to locate proper stores. Evelyn said, I have been here 6 hours. This is what 6 hours looks like. Thomas, the silent one, the sound made a sound that might have been almost a laugh and covered it with a cough. Wyatt didn't say anything else. He picked up his spoon and ate, not enthusiastically, not gratefully, but he ate. Eli, beside Evelyn, said quietly, I like it. She didn't make a fuss of it. Good, she said, and that was that. She did not sleep well her first night, but she hadn't expected to. The room Gideon had set aside for her was small and clean enough. She could tell someone had made an effort in the last few days, probably recently, which meant he had cared at least that much. There was a narrow bed and a dresser, with a cracked mirror and a hook on the back of the door, and the window looked out over the dark shape of the barn. She lay in the unfamiliar dark and listened to the sounds of an unfamiliar house and made herself take stock of what was real. She had $41 saved from her years of domestic work, which was not nothing. She had skills, real ones, not the decorative kind. Cook and preserve and manage a household budget against impossible odds, which was more than most people gave credit for. She could read and keep accounts, and she was not afraid of physical work. What she did not have, a family, a home, a single person in the world who would notice if she failed here. That thought was not new. She let it sit there in the dark for a moment, turned it over, and then set it aside. Self-pity was a luxury she had learned she couldn't afford. She would deal with the kitchen tomorrow. She would start with what was there and work outward. Fell asleep before she finished planning. The next morning she was in the kitchen before anyone else was awake. She had found an apron in the bottom of a trunk in the pantry, someone else's, worn thin at the ties but still serviceable. She put it on and built the fire in the stove from scratch, which took longer than it should have because someone had let ash accumulate until it was blocking the draft. She cleared it, got the fire drawing right, and then stood in the middle of the kitchen and made herself look at everything slowly. The shelves needed scrubbing before anything went back on them. The floor needed sweeping and then washing. The stove needed to be degreased before she could trust what she cooked on it. Table needed more than wiping it, needed sanding, probably, but that could wait. She started with the shelves. She was halfway through the second shelf when she heard boots on the stairs, then a pause in the doorway. She didn't turn around. There's coffee on the stove. Cups are on the right side of the shelf. I already cleaned. A silence. Then the sound of a cup being taken down. She kept working. It was Thomas, the silent 16-year-old, who had come down first. She'd noticed at supper that he watched everything but committed to nothing, the way of a boy who had decided the safest posture was observation. He poured his coffee and stood near the stove and drank it, and she scrubbed the shelf, and she scrubbed the shelf, and neither of them felt the need to make it into anything more than what it was. The second one down was Samuel, the 11-year-old who came in, looked at her, looked at the state of the kitchen, and said, "What are you doing?" "Cleaning." "Why?" "Because it needs it." He considered this. "Can I help?" She looked at him. He had an open face, the kind that hadn't learned yet to hide what it was thinking. She had a feeling Samuel was going to be the easy one. "You can sweep," she said. "The broom is behind the door." He found it and swept badly, at first pushing the dirt around more than gathering it, but she didn't correct him immediately. She let him figure out his own technique for a few minutes before saying, from her position at the shelf, "You're moving it, not picking it up. Short strokes." He tried it. Like that? Better. Swept better after that. It wasn't a transformation, but it was something. By the time the rest of the boys came down, and Gideon came in from morning chores, Evelyn had cleaned 3 shelves, swept the floor, and had something that was almost a proper breakfast, fried potatoes from the root cellar, what was left of the salt pork, and coffee strong enough to count as a statement. Wyatt came into the kitchen, looked at the state of the shelves, looked at Samuel still hovering near Evelyn with a proprietary air that suggested he felt responsible for the progress, and his expression did something complicated. He sat down at the table and said nothing. After breakfast, which was eaten in the same rough silence as the night before, Gideon said, "What do you need from town?" "A list," she said, and handed him the piece of paper she'd already written while the potatoes were frying. Flour, lard, salt, yeast, dried fruit if available, sugar if affordable, a new scrub brush because the current one was past use, and 2 yards of muslin if it wasn't too much. He looked at the list. The muslin? For preserving, possibly curtains, if there's enough. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. He looked at her for a moment, in that same way considering, not quite readable. Then he went to get his coat. Wyatt watched the exchange from the table and said nothing, but he was watching. The flour arrived back from town that afternoon, along with most of the rest of the list. Gideon had added a small bag of oats she hadn't asked for, which she noted without comment. She spent the rest of the afternoon baking. The oven ran hot, which she discovered when the first test biscuits came out darker on the bottom than the top, so she adjusted lower rack, shorter time, rotate halfway through. By the third batch, she had it figured out. The smell of fresh bread moved through the house in a way that Evelyn noticed but didn't comment on. She watched, from the corner of her eye, how the boys drifted toward the kitchen in ones and twos, not dramatically, not suddenly, but the way animals move toward water. Eli appeared first and stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, pretending he was there for another reason. Aaron and James, the twins, came in together and then immediately pretended they hadn't come in on purpose. Even Thomas drifted in at some point and leaned against the wall near the stove, cut the bread when it came out, and gave each of them a piece without ceremony. No performance, no warm speech, just bread. Noah, the 9-year-old who had committed to ignoring her, took his piece without meeting her eyes and walked away chewing. Counted that as progress. Wyatt did not come into the kitchen, but she saw when she passed the window that he had stopped his work at the fence post he'd been setting. and was standing still for a moment, face turned toward the house. She went back to the stove. It was not warmth, what she felt. It wasn't happiness. It was something quieter and less comfortable, the particular feeling of a person who decides to build something and has just laid the first stone in the wall and is already looking at how much further there is to go. But the stone was there, and that was enough to work with. The bread was gone by morning. Not just the loaves she'd set out at supper, the extra she'd wrapped in cloth and left on the shelf above the stove was gone too. And when she came down at first light, she found only crumbs on the cloth and the faint smell of yeast still hanging in the kitchen air. She stood there a moment, looking at the empty shelf. She was not sentimental about it. Food was meant to be eaten, but she noted it the way. She noted everything quietly, without making a fuss, filing it away in the part of her mind that kept track of what was actually happening beneath the surface of things. She rebuilt the fire, set the coffee on, and started on oatmeal because oats were what she had enough of. She'd need to stretch the flour across the week until she had a better sense of what the household consumed, and that required paying attention to patterns she hadn't had time to observe yet. Samuel came down first again. She was beginning to think he was a natural early riser, or possibly that he was positioning himself strategically arriving before his brothers, meant he got to be her temporary ally without any of them seeing it. Children were more political than most adults wanted to admit. "Bread's gone," he announced from the doorway. I noticed. Wyatt probably ate it. He gets up in the middle of the night sometimes. He said this as though it were information she'd asked for. She said, which was neither confirmation nor rejection. "Are you making more today?" "Oatmeal today. Bread tomorrow." He made a face, not an offensive one, just honest, and she handed him the spoon and pointed at the pot. "Sir, don't let it catch on the bottom." He took the spoon with the automatic compliance of a child who had been waiting for someone to give him a direction. That was the thing she was beginning to understand about this family. They didn't need to be broken or managed. They needed to be directed. Somewhere in the year since Gideon's wife had died, the household had simply lost its organizing principle, and everything had drifted: the chores, the meals, the boys' behavior, the state of the kitchen, the whole rhythm of the day. It wasn't destruction. It was entropy. And entropy, in Evelyn's experience, responded well to consistency. She just had to be consistent long enough for them to believe she'd stay. That was the harder part. By the end of the first week, she had established a morning routine that the boys had not agreed to, but had begun to follow anyway. The way people fall into the gravity of a schedule when someone holds it firmly enough. Breakfast at 6:30, which meant the fire was built and the coffee was on by 6. The three oldest, Wyatt, Thomas, and the twins were out with Gideon before breakfast, which meant she kept plates warm on the back of the stove. The younger three ate at the table, and she used that time to run through what needed doing in the day and to assign Samuel, who had appointed himself her unofficial assistant, whatever tasks she needed done inside the house. The kitchen was cleaner. Not clean, that would take more time, but cleaner. The shelves were organized. The stove drew properly now. She'd found a crack in the flue pipe that had been letting heat escape sideways and stuffed it with clay she'd mixed from the dirt at the garden edge. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it was functional, and functional was what she was working toward. The pantry was her next project. She spent a morning pulling everything out of it, and there was more there than she'd initially found, which was both encouraging and instructive. Someone at some point had put up preserves with some skill. There were 8 jars of what turned out to be pickled green beans, still sealed and good. There were 3 jars of apple butter, so old the labels had mostly faded, but when she opened one, it smelled right. There was a sack of cornmeal she hadn't seen behind a broken crate, and a small tin of molasses, and a paper bag of dried apples that were mostly fine once she picked through them. She laid it all out on the kitchen table and inventoried it by hand, writing it in a small notebook she'd brought in her bag. Gideon came in from the barn at mid-morning, stopped in the kitchen doorway, and looked at the table. "What's all this?" "Taking stock. You had more than you knew." She looked up from the notebook. The preserves on the left shelf are still good. The cornmeal was behind a broken crate. I don't know how long it's been there, but it passed the smell test. The dried apples are serviceable. He came around the table and looked at the jars. My wife put those up, he said. He said it plainly, but something in his voice had weight to it. Apple butter. I know. She hadn't known, but she understood immediately. I'll use them carefully. He didn't say anything else. He picked up one of the jars and turned it in his hands for a moment, then set it back down and walked out. She watched him go and then looked back at her notebook and did not make anything of it. She had a sense still uncertain, still forming of what the real shape of this family's grief was. But she was not here to fix grief. She was here to fix the pantry. She put everything back in order and went on with her morning. The town of Cary Springs was small enough that news traveled in one direction, outward from the general store and the post office, and specifically from anyone who had seen or spoken to anyone connected to anything worth discussing. Evelyn learned this on her first trip into town, 8 days after her arrival. When she went to collect a bolt of thread she'd asked Gideon to order for her. She went alone. Gideon had offered to send one of the boys, but she wanted to see the town herself, assess it the way she'd assess the kitchen from the inside, slowly, without someone else's lens. Cary Springs had 2 streets that crossed, and a third that ran parallel to the main one before dead-ending at the livery. It had a general store, a post office, a small hotel that also served as a saloon after dark, a barber shop, a land office, and a dressmaker's shop that doubled as a millinery. There was a church on the far end of the main street that she noted and did not particularly assign meaning to. The woman at the general store, a Mrs. Pickham, 50s, efficient and curious in equal measure, took one look at Evelyn and said, "You must be the new Mercer woman." "Evelyn Hart," she said. Mrs. Pickham got her thread from the back with the speed of someone who had already been planning for this interaction. "How are you finding it up there?" "Fine," Evelyn said. "Those boys giving you trouble?" "No more than expected." Mrs. Pickham set the thread on the counter and her hands on top of each other and looked at Evelyn with the frank appraisal of a woman who had seen a great many things come through her store and formed opinions on most of them. "Clara Calloway was a good woman," she said. "She just wasn't the right kind of tough for that situation. Gideon's a decent man. Rough, but decent." She paused. "He had a hard 2 years, I know." Mrs. Pickham seemed to reach some internal conclusion. She wrapped the thread in paper, without being asked, which Evelyn appreciated. "You need anything else, you let me know. I can hold things for pickup if the trip's inconvenient. Thank you." She paid and turned to go, and that was when she heard the voice from the other side of the store, not loud, not quite, but pitched in that particular way. That meant it was intended to carry, a mail-order bride. Can you imagine having to resort to that? She didn't turn around. She knew without looking who was speaking. She'd seen the woman when she came in, standing at the fabric counter with 2 others, young, well-dressed, the kind of beautiful that had been told about itself too many times. "I heard she came all the way from Ohio. No family, no connections." A pause that had performance in it. "I suppose when you have nothing to offer and nowhere else to go, you take what you can get." Evelyn walked to the door, opened it, and left. She stood on the boardwalk outside for a moment in the late morning air. Her face was neutral. Her jaw was tight, but she made herself relax it. She had heard things like that before. She would hear things like that again. The question was never whether people would say them. Question was what you did afterward, whether you let the words root inside you, or whether you composted them into something useful. She walked back to the wagon she'd borrowed, loaded the thread, and drove home. She did not mention the exchange to Gideon. She did not mention it to any of the boys. She went back to the kitchen and spent the rest of the afternoon reorganizing the dry goods storage according to a system she'd worked out in her head on the drive home. It was more efficient than what had been there before. She did not need anyone to notice. It was Samuel who told her about Rosalie Vane, which she suspected was not accidental. He brought it up the following afternoon while she was showing him how to properly scrub a cast iron pan the right way, which meant hot water and a rag and no soap, and then oil while it was still warm. He had a natural instinct for information delivery. This boy he led with the unimportant thing first, and then circled to the thing he actually meant to say. "She's Mr. Vane's daughter," he said, scrubbing with more enthusiasm than technique. "He owns the lumber mill and the grain storage. Most of the folks in town owe him something, one way or another." "That's useful to know," Evelyn said. "You're scrubbing too hard. Let the heat do the work." He softened his strokes. She wanted to marry Pa, that she hadn't known. She kept her voice even. "When after Mama died?" "About 6 months after. Rosalie Vane came to call twice. Pa wasn't. He wasn't in a good place then." Samuel frowned at the pan. "He didn't ask her to come. Her pa brought her." I think they thought he stopped. Thought what? That Pa might need help with the ranch. He'd be grateful enough for help, that he'd, accept whatever came with it. Yeah. He handed the pan to her, and she oiled it and set it back on the low heat of the stove. He didn't. He was polite about it, but Wyatt said it was real clear he wasn't interested. Evelyn absorbed this. It reframed the woman at the general store in a new way, not just casual cruelty, but something with a wound underneath it. Didn't make the cruelty acceptable, but it made it legible. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked Samuel. He shrugged with the elaborate casualness of an 11-year-old who had planned this conversation. "I just thought you should know." She turned back to the stove. "Thank you." He looked pleased with himself in a way he was trying to suppress. She let him have it. Wyatt was the problem she hadn't solved yet, and she knew it. He wasn't hostile in any way she could directly address. He didn't refuse her instructions or speak rudely to her face or make scenes at the table. He was, in fact, more controlled than boys twice his age, which was its own kind of problem. Complied with everything in a way that communicated clearly and without words that he was choosing to comply and could choose to stop at any time. He watched her. She watched him. They had been in a kind of cold negotiation since the morning she'd arrived, and neither of them had moved significantly toward the other. She understood in an abstract way why he was doing it. He was 19 years old, and he had been the man of this house in every practical sense for over a year. He had held the family together when Gideon had been too deep in grief to function, had managed his younger brothers when nobody else was doing it, kept the ranch running at a bare subsistence level through a year that would have beaten most grown men. He had earned his position the hardest way a person earns anything. And then she had arrived and disrupted the order, and his father had not consulted him. That, she thought, was probably the real issue, not that she was here, but that nobody had asked. She chose her moment carefully. It came on a Wednesday afternoon, when the other boys were occupied, and Wyatt was alone in the barn repairing a saddle with the focused, slightly angry stitching of a man working through something in his head. She brought him coffee without asking if he wanted any. She set it on the workbench beside him and didn't say anything, and she sat on a hay bale across from him and looked at the horse in the nearest stall, which looked back at her with the calm indifference of an animal that has no stake in human drama. Wyatt didn't look up from the saddle. He stitched 3 more passes before he said, "I don't need the coffee." "I know." Another 4 stitches. "What do you want?" "Nothing specific." "Then why are you here?" She considered the direct route, rejected it, chose the honest one instead. "Because you're the one I haven't talked to yet." "Not really." He looked up then. His expression was the complicated, guarded kind that people wear when they're prepared to be mocked and have decided to meet it standing. "What's there to talk about?" "You ran this house for a year," she said. "Not nothing." He was quiet. "I'm not here to tell you that you did it wrong," she continued. "You kept 7 people alive and a ranch going on almost nothing. That's a real thing. I'm not going to pretend I walked in and found a disaster. I found a family that's survived a disaster." He looked back down at the saddle. His jaw was tight. "It wasn't. There were things I couldn't." He stopped, started again. "The younger ones. I couldn't do everything." "No," she said, "you couldn't. You're 19, not 40. One person cannot do everything." A long silence. "I'm not trying to replace anything," she said. "I'm not your mother. I don't have any interest in pretending to be. I'm a woman who needed a situation, and your father offered one, and I'm trying to do the job I agreed to do." She paused. "But the job goes better with you working alongside me than against me. Think you know that." He picked up the coffee finally. He drank some. He set it back down and looked at the horse in the stall, and for a moment he looked exactly his age 19 and exhausted, and carrying something heavier than he should have been handed. "You're not what I expected," he said at last. "What did you expect? Someone softer. Someone who'd try to make us like her. That's not something you can make people do." He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely visible there for a second and then gone. "No," she stood up from the hay bale. "I'm making fried salt pork and beans tonight. It'll be ready at 6. She walked out of the barn and did not look back to see his expression. But that evening, Wyatt came to the table before she called supper, and he helped his youngest brother climb onto his chair without being asked, and he ate without his jaw doing that tight, skeptical thing it usually did. It was not reconciliation. It was not even close to that, but it was a first step in the right direction, and Evelyn was in the business of first steps. The garden was a problem she couldn't solve immediately, and that gnawed at her. The season was too far gone for planting. It was October. Now the mornings sharp with frost, the ground beginning to harden at the edges. Whatever the garden might have been in summer was gone. What remained was a tangle of dead plants and weeds, and the ghost of a structure, raised beds that had once been deliberate, paths between them that had once been clear. She went out to look at it on a Sunday afternoon when the boys were occupied elsewhere and Gideon was doing accounts in the house. She walked the perimeter of it slowly, the way she'd done with the kitchen and the pantry, taking stock. It had been a real kitchen garden once. She could tell from the infrastructure, the depth of the beds, the placement to catch the southern sun, the remnants of a cold frame on the east end that, if repaired, could extend the season by several weeks. Someone had built this with knowledge, not just hope. Someone who had gardened seriously for years. Gideon's wife. She thought about the apple butter in the pantry. She thought about the way Gideon had picked up the jar and held it. She crouched down and pushed aside some dead growth near one of the bed edges, and underneath, where the frost hadn't gotten yet, she found what she'd hoped might be there, a few small, stunted carrots that had been left in the ground and missed at harvest. She pulled one, brushed the dirt off it, bit off the tip. Bitter, but real. She left the carrots where they were. She had an idea about them. Behind her, she heard footsteps light, quick, the particular rhythm of Eli. "What are you doing?" he asked, which was his standard greeting. Looking at the garden. He came and stood beside her and looked at it too, with the focused attention he gave to most things. "Mama grew tomatoes here," he said. "Big ones. Red ones. She used to slice them with salt for supper. That's a good memory to have. Beans. She grew beans and I helped with them." He paused. "I was little." "You're still little." He considered this philosophically. "Wyatt said the garden's too far gone to bother with. Next spring it won't be." He looked at her. "You're planning next spring?" It was a child's question, asked with a child's directness, and it landed squarely in the part of her that was always keeping track of whether she believed her own words. She was planning next spring. That was what the question was really asking, whether she meant to stay. "Yes," she said. "I'm planning next spring." He seemed satisfied with this, crouched down beside her, and started pulling dead plant stalks out of the nearest bed with the energy of a child who has found a task and is fully committed to it for approximately the next 4 minutes. She let him pull. She started thinking about what she'd need to do to prepare the beds over winter so they'd be ready when the grounds softened. 2.5 weeks in, something shifted in the household, and it shifted in the way things usually did, not dramatically, not all at once, but in an accumulation of small moments that you only recognized as a pattern when you looked back at them. Thomas started talking, not to her at first. He started talking more to his brothers at the table, which she took as an indirect sign if the table felt safe enough for conversation, it was because something about the table had changed. He had a dry observational humor that surprised her. He said one morning, watching Aaron attempt to pour coffee and miss the cup by a significant margin. He's been doing that for 2 years. We just stopped warning people. Aaron looked wounded. James, his twin, laughed. Even Wyatt across the table made a sound. It was not a significant event, but it was the first time she'd seen all of them make any sounds in the same direction at once, and she filed it. Noah, the 9-year-old who had sustained his program of pointed indifference to her with remarkable discipline, broke his streak on a Thursday evening when he came into the kitchen while she was making apple butter from the dried apples and asked, without preamble, what she was doing. "Making apple butter," she said. "Out of the dried ones?" Yes, he watched for a minute, from the doorway, his arms crossed, in the stance of a child who is not committed to entry. Taste right? It'll taste different from fresh. Still good. He stood there another moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and came in and stood at the edge of the table, watching her work through the process, the softening of the dried fruit in water, the mashing, the spicing. She handed him a spoon with a small amount on it when the sugar went in. Tasted it. He made a face, then reconsidered the face. "Different," he said, "told you. But it's okay. Glad you think so." He stood there until the apple butter was in the jars, and then he left without saying anything else. But the following morning, he came down to the kitchen at a normal hour without any visible evidence of his previous campaign. Counted that as a negotiated peace. The hardest moment came, as hard moments often do, in the middle of something ordinary. She was mending a shirt, Eli's, which had split at the shoulder seam again, in the way that children's clothes split when children use them, the way children use them, when Gideon came into the kitchen at an unusual hour. It was mid-afternoon, and he was normally outside at this time. Poured himself coffee and stood at the window, which was not his normal behavior either. Kept mending. She waited. "I got a letter," he said, finally. "Good news or bad?" A pause, unclear. He turned from the window, from the bank in Cheyenne. There's a payment coming due on the ranch, from a loan I took out after Margaret died." He stopped. He was not a man who exposed difficulty easily, and she could see the effort of the current exposure. "I didn't. I let some things slide when last year was a bad year." "How much?" he told her. The number was significant, not catastrophic. If the cattle sale in spring went well, but significant enough that it required actual management. "When's it due?" "March." She set the mending down and thought, "How many head are you selling this spring?" He told her that too. She did the arithmetic in her head, rough but directional. "If we cut household spending by about a third between now and then, and the cattle price holds where it was last year, you make it," she said. "If you can get any extra work out of the ranch between now and spring," she trails off. "What else can this land carry?" He blinked. "What? Chickens? I haven't seen any. Eggs would cut your food costs significantly." He stared at her for a moment. Then he said, slowly, "Margaret had chickens. After she died, the coyotes got into the coop one night, and I didn't rebuild it. I can look at the coop." She picked up the mending again. "What I'm saying is, it's manageable, but it requires managing." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Why are you doing this?" "Which part?" "Any of it. All of it here." For he stopped. "You came here with a contract, a roof, an arrangement. You didn't come here to fix my accounts." She looked at him directly. "I came here because I needed a situation. The situation I found is this ranch, these boys, and this debt. If I'm going to be here, I'd rather it stay standing." He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her when she said something that he was deciding what to do with. It was a look that had something behind it that she hadn't fully identified yet, not just assessment, not just calculation. Something that made her uncomfortable in a way she set firmly to one side. "The coop's behind the barn," he said, "north side. It's in bad shape." "Most things out here are," she said. "That doesn't mean they can't be fixed." He set down his coffee cup and went back outside. She finished the mending and started on supper and did not spend time thinking about the look on his face. She had enough to think about already. The week before the harvest gathering, Evelyn made a decision she didn't announce. Flour, and she had the last of the dried apples from her reorganized stores, and she had found a recipe in her own memory, her aunt's apple pie, which her aunt had made every October with a confidence that had seemed to Evelyn as a child like a kind of power. She hadn't made it since her aunt died, 7 years back, not because she couldn't, but because there had never been anyone to make it for. She made it on a Saturday afternoon when the kitchen was briefly empty. Pie crust was the honest kind, not delicate, but solid, with enough fat to hold its own in a working oven. The filling she spiced from memory: cinnamon, a small amount of the remaining molasses for depth, a pinch of salt. She did not have fresh apples, which was a problem she solved by reconstituting the dried ones slowly in a small amount of water and cider vinegar until they softened back towards something real. Pie was not going to be beautiful. The crust cracked slightly in one corner during baking. The filling was darker than it should have been because the dried apples caramelized differently than fresh. But when she pulled it out of the oven and let it cool on the window ledge, the smell was right, exactly right. The kind of smell pulled at something old and specific in whoever caught it. The first person who caught it was Gideon, coming in to wash before supper. He stopped in the doorway and stood there for a moment without saying anything, and something went across his face that she looked away from deliberately, because it was private. She heard him exhale, slow. "That's Margaret's recipe," he said. "I wouldn't know," she said carefully. "It's my aunt's." Another pause. "Where'd your aunt learn it?" "Ohio farm country. Same as 1,000 other women." She kept her back to him. She heard him move to the sink, pour water, wash his hands. When she turned around, he was already heading back out, and his face was the face he usually showed the world, closed, settled, giving nothing away. That was fine. She wasn't looking to pry anything out of him. The pie was for the harvest gathering. She had already decided that. The gathering was in 4 days, at the community hall in Cary Springs, and Gideon had mentioned it with the flat tone of a man who was going, because he always went, and not for any other reason. She'd said she'd bring food, and he hadn't argued. She wrapped the pie in cloth and set it on the highest shelf. Eli found it within 20 minutes. She heard the stool scraping and came into the kitchen to find him balanced on it, reaching. "That's not for now," she said. He looked at her over his shoulder, hands still extended toward the pie. "When's it for?" "The harvest gathering." He got down from the stool with the expression of a child managing significant disappointment with dignity. 4 days, yes. What if it goes bad? It won't. He looked at her, then back at the pie, then at her again. "Can I smell it?" She almost laughed, which surprised her. She didn't quite. "You already did," she said. "That's what brought you in here." He conceded this point by sitting down at the table and accepting the small square of cornbread she cut him instead, and eating it without further negotiation. She went back to the stove. 4 days to the gathering. She had bread to bake, preserves to jar, and the particular problem of Rosalie Vane to consider, because Samuel's information, combined with what she'd heard in the general store, told her that the gathering was not going to be a neutral event. She had spent her life being underestimated. She had learned that the best response to being underestimated was not to argue with the estimation, but to simply do the work and let the work speak in a volume that arguments couldn't reach. Pie was part of that. The bread was part of that. Preserves were part of that. She was not building a defense. She was building a record, and on the day of the gathering, that record was going to speak for itself, whether Rosalie Vane liked it or not. The morning of the harvest gathering, Evelyn was up before the dark had fully lifted. She had slept badly, not from nerves, she'd told herself, but from the particular restlessness of a mind that wouldn't stop running through lists. The bread she'd baked the day before was wrapped in cloth on the kitchen shelf. The 2 jars of preserves, she'd selected the pickled green beans and the better of the 2 apple butters were in the wooden crate she'd found in the barn. Pie was wrapped separately, nestled in a nest of clean cloth so the crust wouldn't crack further on the wagon ride. She built the fire, put the coffee on, and stood at the kitchen window in the gray pre-dawn and looked at nothing in particular. She was not afraid of Rosalie Vane. That was true in the way that most honest statements are not complete, but accurate enough to work with. What she felt was something more like the focused attention of a person walking into a room where she knows the furniture has been rearranged in the dark. Don't stop walking. You just pay attention to where you put your feet. Gideon came down earlier than usual. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, looked at her, looked at the packed crate, and said nothing about any of it. He poured his coffee and drank it standing at the counter, and when he put the cup down, he said, "We'll leave at 8. It's an hour's drive. I'll be ready." He started to leave, then stopped. "You don't have to come if you don't want to." She turned from the window. "I know. Rosalie Vane will be there." He said it plainly. Not as a warning exactly. More like a man clearing his throat before a difficult sentence to make sure the words came out right. Her father's on the harvest committee. The Vanes always have a table. Samuel told me about the Vanes. Something moved across his face, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Did he? He thought I should know. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "She's not Rosalie isn't a bad person," he said with the slightly pained tone of someone who doesn't fully believe their own charitable assessment, but is committed to making it. "She's just her father's raised her to think the world's its attention." That's a generous interpretation. It's the one I've got. He went back upstairs. She turned back to the window and thought about what he'd just done, offered her an out, and then offered her context in that order. Neither one was an accident. Gideon Mercer, she was learning, communicated through the things he said sequentially rather than the things he said directly. She finished her coffee and went to wake the boys. Community Hall in Cary Springs was a large barn-like structure on the eastern edge of town that had been built for exactly this kind of occasion-wide plank floors, long trestle tables along 3 walls, cleared space in the center for whatever activities the day required. By the time the Mercer wagon rolled in at 9, the lot outside was already filling with wagons and horses, and the sound coming from inside had the particular quality of a crowd that had been building energy since early morning. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon seat before anyone could offer help and went around to the back to get her crate. Eli appeared immediately at her elbow with the proprietary helpfulness that had become his standard operating mode. "I can carry the pie," he said. "You can carry the beans," she said, and handed him the jar, which was heavier than it looked. He staggered slightly and adjusted his grip and followed her toward the hall with the focused dignity of a child carrying something important. The other boys piled out of the wagon with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Samuel was genuinely interested. He'd mentioned twice the previous evening that there would be apple cider at the gathering. Thomas was neutral in the way he was neutral about most things. The twins were already scanning the crowd for boys their age. Noah stayed close to Wyatt without making it obvious he was doing so. Wyatt walked with his hands in his pockets and his hat pushed back slightly, and the general air of a young man attending an obligation. Gideon walked beside Evelyn without quite walking beside her. There was a distance of about 2 feet between them, not deliberate, or not entirely, but present. She noted it and filed it with the other things she was noting. Inside the hall, the smell hit her first cider and sawdust and food from a dozen different kitchens, the particular warm smell of too many people in an enclosed space. Tables were set up along the walls, and women were arranging their contributions with the focused competitiveness that polite people pretend doesn't exist at events like this. There were pies and bread and preserved goods and casseroles in Dutch ovens, and the arrangement of things on each table had clearly been given more thought than most of the women present would have admitted to. Evelyn found an open section of table near the middle of the left wall and set down her crate. She was unpacking the bread when she felt it, the shift in the room's ambient noise that happens when someone notable enters and people adjust their conversations to accommodate the new presence. She didn't turn around. She kept unpacking, but she heard the voice. "Look at that." The Mercer table. Rosalie Vane's voice was exactly as Evelyn remembered it from the general store projected, with the practiced confidence of a woman who had never had to wonder whether she was worth listening to. I didn't realize we were expecting so many contributions this year. Polite laughter from somewhere to Evelyn's right. She placed the bread on the table, unwrapped the cloth, and moved to the preserves. Is that the apple butter? A new voice, one of the women from Rosalie's circle, curious rather than cruel. It smells wonderful. It's reconstituted, Evelyn said without turning around. Dried apples. We didn't have fresh this season. She heard the small pause that followed the gnide. Kind of pause that means something has surprised someone. Then Rosalie's voice again, closer now. How practical. Evelyn finally turned around. Rosalie Vane in person was more than just pretty. She had the kind of look that people in small towns sometimes produced, where generations of relative prosperity and a certain gene for good bones had combined into something that the town had built a story around. She was 23 or 24, Evelyn guessed. She wore a dress that had been made for this occasion, not ostentatiously expensive, but carefully chosen to suggest effortlessness. Her hair was dark and arranged with precision. Her eyes were sharp and pale, and currently performing the social maneuver of appearing friendly while assessing. "You must be Miss Hart," she said, with a smile that was perfectly calibrated to the situation. "Mrs. Mercer," Evelyn said, because that was the correct form of address, whatever the marriage had been in feeling, and she had decided on the drive over that she would use it. Something shifted in Rosalie's expression, barely visible, but real. The use of the married name had landed somewhere. "Of course," she said. "Forgive me." She tilted her head slightly. "We were all so surprised when Gideon, well, particular arrangement, isn't it? We all wish you well. Naturally." "Naturally," Evelyn said. "It takes a certain kind of woman," Rosalie continued, looking at the table, "to come into a situation like that. No family connections." "No," she gestured vaguely. "It's very brave. Or perhaps just very practical." The smile stayed in place. "I suppose when your options are limited, practicality becomes a virtue." The women around her made small sounds of demoral that meant the opposite of demoral. Evelyn looked at Rosalie Vane for a moment with the expression she had perfected over 31 years of being underestimated, calm, attentive, and entirely unintimidated. "The pie needs to breathe before serving," she said. "Excuse me." She turned back to the table and unwrapped the pie, and Rosalie Vane, without anything to push against, moved on. The gathering ran through the morning and into the afternoon, and it had the texture of all such events, part genuine celebration, part community business, part social performance. There was a brief ceremony involving the harvest committee and a reading of tallies that everyone listened to with the particular politeness of people who have already heard the numbers through the town's informal information network. Then the food was served and the real business of the day began. Evelyn stayed at her table. She was not performing modesty or strategic retreat. She genuinely had work to do, slicing the bread evenly, making sure the preserves were properly labeled so people understood what they were taking, keeping the pie intact until the right moment. She had a role, and she was playing it, and the playing of it did not require her to circulate and make herself agreeable to people who had already formed opinions about her. First person to stop at her table, who was not from her household, was a woman named Agnes Booth, mid-50s, a farmer's wife from the northern edge of the county, with hands that told the same story as Evelyn's own hands. She looked at the bread with an experienced eye, cut herself a slice without waiting to be invited, and chewed it slowly. "Good crumb," she said. "What's your flour?" "Mill ground from Cary Springs. Mixed with a little cornmeal I ran low." Agnes nodded. "Cornmeal helps in a dry autumn. Keeps the moisture longer." She looked at the apple butter. "Can I try that?" "Please." She tried it. She was quiet for a moment. "Different from fresh." "Yes." "Better in some ways," Agnes said almost to herself. "Deeper." She looked at Evelyn with the frank assessment of a woman who was interested only in reality. "You've been managing the Mercer kitchen how long now?" 3 weeks. Agnes raised her eyebrows, not in surprise at the quality of the food, Evelyn thought, but at the timeline. She seemed to be doing her own arithmetic. "You've got your work cut out for you," she said, which was the most honest, and therefore the most useful thing anyone at the gathering had yet said to her. "I know," said Evelyn. Agnes cut herself another piece of bread and moved on. Others came not in a flood, but steadily, the way people drift toward things that smell right. Couple from the eastern edge of town who didn't seem to know the social architecture of the Vane situation and simply wanted to eat. Two of the harvest committee men who came for the pie and stayed to ask about the apple butter. A woman about Evelyn's age named Clara Whitfield, who had moved to the county 2 years ago and had the particular solidarity that comes from being an outsider in a place where everyone else has 20 years of shared history. "I heard about you before I saw you," Clara said. She was small and frank, and had a baby on her hip who was conducting an independent investigation of Evelyn's sleeve. "People talk. I've noticed. Don't let it bother you." "It doesn't," Evelyn said, which was mostly true. Clara looked at her with the directness of a woman who has decided life is too short for social softening. Rosalie Vane has been the only woman in this county under 35 with any social standing for a while. She's not used to company at that level. I'm not. She doesn't know that. Clara detached her baby from Evelyn's sleeve with the practiced move of a woman who has done this 1,000 times. It's its own kind of problem. Pie went out at noon, when the room was at its fullest. Evelyn had been watching the rhythm of the gathering, the way the energy crested and ebbed, and she had timed it not manipulatively, just practically. People were ready for something sweet at noon, and the hall was loud and warm and full. And when she sliced the pie, the smell expanded outward in the way that smells do enclosed, warm spaces. Samuel appeared at her elbow immediately. "Is that?" "Yes," she said. "You can have the second piece, after everyone's been offered first." Stationed himself at the table with the patience of a child who has negotiated a deal and intends to hold both parties to it. The pie moved faster than she'd expected. People stopped and took slices, and the expressions on their faces were the honest kind that food produces when it's the right thing at the right moment. Agnes Booth came back for a second look. The Harvest Committee men sent a third man she hadn't met. Even Wyatt, who had spent the morning on the other side of the hall, talking to boys his own age with his back, mostly to his family's table, came over and stood at the edge of her space and took a slice without ceremony and ate it standing up and said in a voice low enough that it was clearly not meant to carry, "It's good." She didn't make a thing of it. "There's enough for a second piece if you want." He took the second piece. He went back to his conversation. She stored that away next to the moment in the barn, and the morning he'd come to breakfast early, and she thought things shift slowly and unevenly and without announcement. But they shift. She was cutting the last of the pie when Rosalie Vane returned. She had 3 women with her this time, which was not accidental. An audience was a structural choice, not a coincidence. She came to the table with the ease of a woman who owns every room she enters, and she looked at the nearly empty pie dish, and at the depleted bread, and at the near-empty jar of apple butter, and something moved behind her eyes. That wasn't quite what Evelyn expected. It wasn't anger. It was something older and more complicated than anger. But she covered it quickly, and what replaced it was the smile. "It seems your baking was well received," she said. "The women here are always so generous. They'll eat anything if it comes with a hard luck story." The table went very still. The women around Rosalie made small sounds of discomfort. "I don't know that I have a hard luck story," Evelyn said. "I came to Wyoming and I started working. That's not particularly dramatic." "But it is, isn't it?" Rosalie's voice was warm with fake sympathy. "Come all this way with nothing for a man you'd never met and 7 boys who didn't want you there." She paused. "It's very brave, or very desperate. Sometimes confuse the two." "Rosalie." One of the women beside her said it quietly. A warning. Rosalie didn't hear it, or chose not to. She was looking at Evelyn's table, at the bread, at the empty preserve jars, at the cracked crust of the pie sitting in its cloth. I'm sure a woman who grew up with real advantages, a proper family, a proper education, a proper name might have found a different path. She smiled. But this is a perfectly respectable way to find a situation, I suppose. For a woman whose skills begin and end in the kitchen. The room nearby had gone quiet. Not the whole hall. It was too large and too loud for that. But the 10 or 12 people within hearing distance had become very still in the way that people do when something real is happening that they aren't sure how to respond to. Evelyn looked at Rosalie Vane. She looked at her the way she looked at a stove that was running too hot, the calm assessment of a person who has dealt with this kind of thing before and is not surprised by it. "You have a beautiful dress," Evelyn said. Rosalie blinked. She hadn't expected that. "The fabric is good quality," Evelyn continued. She was not being cruel. She was being precise. "The cut is very fine. You've clearly had excellent makers available to you." She let that sit for exactly one beat. Some women express their intelligence through what they wear. It's a legitimate form of skill. The pause that followed was the particular kind of pause that comes when a room isn't sure whether what it heard was a compliment or something else. Rosalie's expression did something complicated. Her jaw didn't tighten. She was too controlled for that. But something behind her eyes sharpened into something real for the first time. "And some women," she said quietly, "think a good pie is enough to make a family." "No," Evelyn said. "A pie is just a pie." She began wrapping the remaining cloth around the empty dish. "But knowing how to make one from nothing, when the pantry's nearly empty, and 7 people need feeding, and it's October, and the garden's dead, that's not nothing." She lifted the crate from the table. She looked at Rosalie directly. "I didn't come here to compete with you," she said. "I came here to bring food to a community gathering and go home to my family." She picked up the crate. "I hope you enjoy the rest of the afternoon." She turned and walked away from the table, and the 10 or 12 people in the vicinity of that exchange watched her go, and not one of them moved to fill the silence she left behind. She found Eli near the cider barrel as predicted. He had apple cider on his chin, and the blissed expression of a child who has reached his primary objective. "Ready to go home?" he asked, which suggested he was ready to go home. "Not yet," she said. "Go find your brothers." She set the crate down near the door and turned to survey the room, and that was when she saw it, Gideon, across the hall, in conversation with a man she didn't recognize. He was listening with the focused posture he had when something required his full attention. The other man was talking with his hands, which was usually a sign of either enthusiasm or anxiety, and from across the room she couldn't tell which. Wyatt was beside his father. He had moved without Evelyn noticing, which told her he'd seen the same thing she was seeing. She started across the room. She was halfway there when Rosalie Vane stepped into her path. Not aggressively. There was no physical obstruction, just a positioning that made it clear the encounter was intended. She had left her companions at the other table, and she was alone now, and without the audience. Her face was different. The performance had come down several degrees. "Miss Hart," she used the wrong form of address again, deliberately. "A word." "All right," Evelyn said. "What you said before Rosalie stopped." She was choosing her words with a precision that Evelyn suspected didn't come naturally to her. "I want you to understand that this county, this community, has a certain way of doing things, a certain order." She paused. "Gideon Mercer he's well regarded here. He's always been well regarded. I know that. What I'm saying is," she stopped again, and for just a moment, beneath the calibrated surface, Evelyn saw it the thing she'd caught a glimpse of at the table. Not malice. Something more like pain and embarrassment, and the particular anger of a person who has been embarrassed and isn't sure what to do with it. "What I'm saying is that appearances matter in a place like this." "I agree," Evelyn said. Rosalie looked at her. She seemed to be waiting for something more, a flinch, a concession, some indication that the morning's campaign had left a mark. "Appearances matter," Evelyn said again, "which is why I came today and brought food and did the work in front of people." She met Rosalie's eyes. "I know what I am. I'm a woman who came here with one bag and no family and took a difficult situation because it was what was available. I know that's not the story this county would have written for Gideon. She looked at the other woman steadily. But it's what happened, and I intend to make it work. Rosalie's jaw was tight. Whatever she had expected from this conversation, it wasn't this not the flat, unapologetic delivery of fact. You're very confident for someone who's been here 3 weeks, she said. I'm not confident, Evelyn said. I'm just honest about what I've got. She picked up her crate. Excuse me. I need to find my husband. She moved past Rosalie Vane and across the hall to where Gideon stood. The man Gideon was talking to was named Harlan Press, and he was not good news. She read that in the way Wyatt's shoulders were set before she heard a word of what was being said. Wyatt had a particular posture for situations he was trying to manage, while simultaneously communicating to his father that he was alarmed, square, and controlled, but with a tension in the line of his back that she recognized from the barn, from the dinner table, from every moment in the past 3 weeks when something had gone wrong, and he'd absorbed it silently. Came up beside Gideon. He glanced at her, then back at Harlan Press. Press was about 50, with the soft, settled look of a man who had made his money doing something that didn't require physical work and knew it. He had small eyes that moved quickly and a handshake quality she could tell from the way he adjusted his position when she arrived of a man who categorized people by usefulness. This is my wife, Gideon said Evelyn. This is Harlan Press. He runs the cattle brokerage out of Cheyenne, Mrs. Mercer, Press said, with a nod that was polite and dismissive in equal measure. I was just telling your husband about next spring's market. Is it good news? She asked. A pause the kind that means no. The market's soft, Press said. There's been an overstock situation in the eastern markets. We're looking at prices about 15% below last year. Did the arithmetic without showing that she was doing it. 15% below last year's price changed the March calculation in a significant way. Not insurmountably, but significantly. How certain is that estimate? She asked. Press looked at her with the mild surprise of a man unused to being questioned by women at community gatherings. Market projections aren't certain, Mrs. Mercer, but our brokers are. I understand their projections, she said. I'm asking about the range. Is 15% the midpoint or the floor? Another pause. Wyatt made no sound, but she felt his attention shift. Midpoint, Press said, with a slight recalibration of his tone. Could be better. Could reach 20. 20% below last year changed things more seriously. She looked at Gideon, and he looked at her, and the look communicated more in 2 seconds than they had managed in most conversations. She understood that he'd been calculating the same numbers she was, and that his face was neutral, not because he wasn't alarmed, but because he'd decided this was not the place to show it. Thank you for telling us, she said to Press. We'll need to review our spring plans. Press nodded, made a few more remarks that amounted to sympathy, dressed up as information, and moved on. In the silence that followed, Wyatt said very quietly, "How bad?" Gideon didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the middle distance, with the expression she'd seen at the fence. Post, the expression of a man looking at a problem he hasn't finished forming a response to. We'll talk tonight, Evelyn said, because this was not the conversation to have in a public hall. There are options. We need to know the real number first. Both of them looked at her. Wyatt with his guarded, considering look, Gideon with something more complicated. Tonight, Gideon said. He nodded. They were loading the wagon in the late afternoon when it happened. The hall had mostly cleared, and the remaining people were gathered in small clusters. In the yard, the way events wind down slowly, in stages with several false endings. The boys were at the wagon, in various states of readiness. Eli had fallen asleep against the wheel and been propped there by Thomas, who was leaning against the wagon side with his arms folded, apparently guarding him. Rosalie Vane came out of the hall, with her father and 3 or 4 others, moving toward their own carriage. Passed within 20 feet of the Mercer wagon, and she might have passed without incident. She might have let the afternoon end without another movement, except that One of the women with her said something, and Rosalie laughed, and the laugh had a direction to it. It was aimed at the wagon, at Evelyn, who was wrapping the empty crate. The whole tableau of 7 boys, and a tired wagon, and a woman in a plain dress, packing up the remnants of her contribution to the harvest gathering. Quite the family operation, Rosalie said, not quite to the group around her, not quite to the open air. A mail-order wife running a bread stall at the harvest gathering. She smiled at the woman beside her. It's very industrious. The laughter that followed was small, private, the kind that comes from people who follow someone else's lead before they've decided how they feel. The boys heard it. She knew they'd heard it, because the quality of stillness around the wagon changed the particular stillness that settles over a group of people who have received an insult in public and are waiting to see what the adult is going to do about it. Evelyn finished wrapping the crate. She lifted it into the wagon bed, turned around. And then something happened that she hadn't planned, hadn't anticipated, hadn't included in any version of this afternoon's calculation. Gideon spoke. He had been standing at the wagon head, checking the harness, and she had thought he hadn't heard. He was 15 feet away, and the sound of the yard covered a great deal. But he had heard. He turned from the harness, and he looked at Rosalie Vane with an expression that was not angry, exactly, but had the quality of a man who has reached the end of a patience that had been quietly running for some time. "Rosalie," he said. She turned. She hadn't expected to be addressed. The smile stayed on her face from momentum. Evelyn didn't come to this county to run a bread stall. His voice was level and clear, not loud, but with the carrying quality of a man who spent his days outdoors and knew how to make words travel. She came because I asked her to, because this family needed someone, and I wasn't in any condition to manage it alone. He paused with weight. She came into a house that was falling apart, and she put it back together in 3 weeks. She fed my boys. She fixed the stove. She found a way to bring food to this gathering from a pantry that had almost nothing in it. Rosalie's smile had gone still. "I'm not interested in what you think of the arrangement," Gideon continued. "I haven't been for a while. But I won't stand here while you make her the punchline of your afternoon." He turned back to the harness. "We're heading home now." The yard was quiet. Not completely. There were still sounds from the far end. Conversations continuing, horses shifting. But in the immediate vicinity of the Mercer wagon, a circle of silence had fallen that was different from ordinary quiet. Rosalie Vane stood in it. Whatever she had expected from the afternoon, and Evelyn suspected she had expected a great many things, she had not expected this. She had not expected Gideon Mercer to look at her across a public yard and speak. Her father put a hand on her elbow and said something quiet and led her away, and the group around her peeled off in stages, and within a minute the Vane party had moved on. Evelyn stood at the wagon side. She did not feel triumphant. That wasn't what moved through her in that moment. It was something less comfortable and more real. Something that had to do with the fact that someone had stood up in public and said a true thing on her behalf. She had not asked for it. She had not expected it. She had been fully prepared to drive home in silence with the afternoon's wounds and take them apart privately and set them aside. She hadn't known what to do with someone stepping in. Took her a moment to arrange her face into something normal. She picked up Eli, who had woken up at some point and was looking around with the fuzzy confusion of a child who has missed something important, and put him in the wagon bed. Wyatt came and stood beside her. He was looking at where Rosalie Vane's carriage was pulling away from the far end of the yard, and his expression was the complicated kind that 19-year-olds get when the world has done something that rearranges their understanding of it. "That's the first time I've ever heard him say something like that," Wyatt said. He said it quietly, not to Evelyn specifically, almost to himself. Public like that. She didn't know how to answer that. She got into the wagon instead. The ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the ride in. The boys were subdued, not unhappily, but in the way of people who have witnessed something significant and are internally working through what it meant. Even the twins, who usually filled silence with lateral commentary, sat without speaking for a long stretch of the road. Gideon drove without speaking. Evelyn sat beside him and looked at the late afternoon light coming across the land and thought about the bank debt and the soft cattle market and the March deadline and the chicken coop that needed rebuilding and all of the practical, immediate, real things that were waiting for them at the end of this road. She thought about the way Gideon's voice had sounded across the yard. She told herself firmly that the practical things were what required her attention. She was mostly successful. It was Wyatt who started the conversation at supper that evening. He hadn't expected it. She'd expected Gideon to call a family meeting, or to talk to her privately, or to handle the financial information in some other form that kept the younger boys at a remove from the difficulty. Instead, it was Wyatt, halfway through the bean and salt pork that was supper that night, who said, "The cattle price is going to be lower next spring." A ripple around the table. Thomas looked up. The twins exchanged a glance. "How much lower?" Thomas asked. Wyatt looked at Evelyn, not at his father. At her, she understood the look. He was acknowledging something, the arithmetic she'd done in the hall, the way she'd asked. Press the real question, the fact that she'd said tonight and meant it. He was acknowledging that she was part of this. She looked at Gideon. Gideon was watching his eldest son. Something moved across his face, and she thought, from what she was beginning to understand about him, that it might have been relief, the particular relief of a man who has been carrying something alone and has just felt another hand come to the weight. 15 to 20%, Gideon said. He put it on the table plainly, the way she'd learned he did things when he decided to do them, below last year's price. That's a problem with the bank payment coming in March. Silence. "So what do we do?" Samuel asked. He was looking between Gideon and Evelyn with the practical curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned that some questions adults don't answer at the table. "We reduce what we spend before March," Evelyn said. "We look at what the ranch can produce that it isn't producing now, and we go through the accounts and find every place there's waste, and we cut it." "Chickens," Eli said. He was looking at her. "You said chickens." "Yes." She had said that to Gideon 3 days ago. She was mildly surprised Eli knew about it, but she shouldn't have been Eli. She had learned, absorbed information osmotically. Coop needs rebuilding. If we get laying hens before winter settles fully, we can have eggs through the cold months. Eggs cut food costs. "I can rebuild the coop," Wyatt said. He said it directly to Gideon, not to her, which was right. Gideon looked at his son. "You've got enough work already. Thomas can help." Wyatt glanced at his brother. Thomas nodded without making it dramatic. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." Around the table, something settled. Not solved. Nothing was solved. The numbers were still the numbers, and March was still March, and the land was still what it was. But something had settled, and Evelyn thought that this was what she'd been working toward, without knowing exactly what it would look like. A table where the problem was on the table, and the people at the table were looking at it together. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't family, not yet, not in the full sense. It was something earlier than that, the raw structure, the bones of it, the thing you build before you build the rest. She ate her supper and listened to the boys talk, and for the first time since she'd arrived on that porch and set down her bag, she did not feel entirely like a stranger in this house. The accounts were worse than she'd expected, and she'd expected bad. Gideon brought the ledger to the kitchen table 3 days after the harvest gathering, after the boys were in bed and the fire had banked down to coals, and he set it in front of her without preamble. She opened it and spent 20 minutes reading through it in silence while he sat across from her with his coffee going cold and his hands flat on the table the way men's hands go when they're waiting for a verdict. The ledger was not dishonest. That was the first thing she noted. There was no attempt to hide what had happened. The record was clear, just bleak. The year after Margaret's death was written in the numbers as plainly as in anything else. Supply costs had gone up because nobody had been managing them. Maintenance had been deferred on things that should have been addressed. And a payment on the land note that should have been made in June had been missed and rolled forward with interest. The cattle receipts from last spring were lower than they should have been. She suspected they'd sold too early, when prices were still soft, because Gideon hadn't been in any condition to hold and wait. She did not say any of this out loud. She read it and sat with it, and then she took the pencil she'd brought to the table and began working figures in the margin. Gideon watched her without speaking. She'd appreciated that. A man who watched without speaking while a woman did arithmetic was rarer than it should have been. The interest has added about $60 to what you owe, she said, without looking up, which means the March payment is larger than the original note. Yes, and the cattle price projection from press puts you short. She did the multiplication. About $90 if prices hit the middle of his range. More if they drop to the floor. Yes. She looked up. What else do you have that's liquid? He was quiet for a moment. There's about $40 in the strong box. I kept it back from last spring for emergencies. All right. She looked back at the ledger. So the gap is somewhere between $50 and $150, depending on spring prices. That's how I have it. She tapped the pencil against the margin. The chickens help, but not by March. That's a long-term reduction, not an immediate one, she thought. The timber situation on the north pasture. I noticed there were trees there, good ones. He looked at her. There are. We've never logged them. Could you? Before March. A pause. The lumber mill, the vein mill. I know who runs it, she said. Is there another buyer? He thought. There's a mill in Rawlins. Smaller operation. I've sold to them before, years back. Can you contact them? I can. She made a note. What about the hay stores? You have more than you need for your own stock this winter. A little more. Agnes Booth's family, she mentioned at the gathering that they had a difficult summer for their own hay. Would they buy surplus? He was looking at her with that expression. She was becoming more familiar with, the one that meant he was processing something he hadn't expected. Probably, he said slowly. It's not a large amount. It adds to the small amount from the timber and the reduced household spending, and it becomes something workable, she said. She looked back at the ledger. You're not far from making this, Gideon. You're close enough that it's a management problem, not a survival problem. Those are different things. He was quiet. She kept her eyes on the ledger. I let it get away from me, he said. I know. Last year, there were months where I couldn't. He stopped. The sentence didn't have an end he was willing to say out loud. I know, she said again. She closed the ledger. She put the pencil down. She looked at him directly. The ledger's fixable, she said. I'm not going to tell you it isn't a problem, because it is, but it's a problem with a path through it. She paused. Right to the Rawlins mill this week. I'll talk to Agnes Booth about the hay next time I'm in town. He nodded. He picked up his coffee, realized it was cold, set it back down. You didn't have to look at that, he said. You brought it to the table. I know, I just meant. He stopped again. She waited. I've had it 6 months without showing anyone, not even Wyatt. She understood what he was saying. She wasn't sure she had a response that would land right, so she said simply, Thank you for showing me. He looked at her. The fire had burned low enough that the kitchen was lit by the one lamp on the table, and in that light his face was less guarded than she'd seen it, not open, not soft, but stripped of some of its usual controlled distance. You're not what I expected, he said. Wyatt said the same thing, she told him. Something crossed his face that was almost a smile. What did you expect? He asked. From what, exactly? From this. From all of it. She thought about the honest answer. I expected to work. I expected it to be hard. I expected to feel like an outsider for a long time. She paused. I didn't expect the ledger, or the boys specifically. Or she stopped herself from finishing that sentence, because the ending of it was you, and that was not a sentence she was ready to examine. Or what, he asked. Or Wyoming winters, she said. I've heard they're significant. He accepted the deflection without pressing. They are, he said, and that was the end of that. Coop went up the following week. Wyatt and Thomas worked on it with the focused efficiency of two people who had decided on a task and didn't need to discuss it much. Wyatt framed it. Thomas handled the detail work, the wire, the nesting boxes, the door latch. They worked mostly in silence, which Evelyn observed from a distance and thought was its own kind of language between brothers. She found 12 laying hens through Agnes Booth, who knew a family 12 miles north that had more than they needed and was willing to sell. Price was fair. Gideon drove up to collect them on a Saturday morning and came back with the hens in a wooden crate in the wagon bed. And Eli spent the entire afternoon sitting cross-legged in front of the coop, watching them like they were the most interesting thing he'd encountered in his 6 years. "The brown one is the boss," he announced at supper. "How can you tell?" Samuel asked. She pushed the others away from the best corner. Noah, who had been eating in his usual silent communion with his food, said, without looking up, "That sounds like a person, not a chicken." It was the funniest thing Noah had said at the table in the weeks Evelyn had been there, and the laughter that came from it, from all of them, including Gideon, which was not common, had a looseness to it that she hadn't heard before. She laughed too. Real laughter, not polite. Thomas looked at her when she laughed, and she caught the look brief, assessing some, and then something that was almost warm. Thomas was the one she understood least. Still, he'd been loosening gradually, like a knot that gives a little at a time, and she didn't push it. She just waited and worked and let the loosening happen on its own timeline. After supper, when the boys had gone to their various occupations and the kitchen was hers, again, she sat at the table and wrote to the Rollins mill on Gideon's behalf. He'd asked her to his handwriting was functional but slow, and the letter needed to strike the right tone between informational and businesslike without appearing desperate. She wrote 3 drafts before she was satisfied, and when she showed him the final one, he read it and said, "That's better than what I would have written. You would have led with the price before establishing the timber quality," she said. "Never lead with price when you're selling something. Make them want it first." He looked at her with that expression. "Where did you learn that, my aunt?" She sold eggs and preserves out of her farm for 30 years. She had opinions about negotiation. He studied the letter for another moment. She sounds like someone worth knowing. She was. Past tense settled. He didn't ask about it. He signed the letter in his even slow hand, and they sent it with the post the following day. November came in with wind and a quality of cold that had edges to it, not the worst. Yet she knew from everything she'd been told, but a preview. The mornings had frost thick enough to crunch under boots, and the light shifted to the flat, directionless white of approaching winter. The house, at least, was warmer than it had been. When she arrived, she'd found and sealed 2 more drafts in the walls of the main room, and the kitchen ran warm enough now that it pushed heat into the hallway. She had settled into a rhythm that she no longer had to think about consciously, which was the sign that it had become real rather than performance. Wake before light, build the fire, coffee on. Breakfast for whoever came down first. Work through the morning on whatever the morning required. Midday was variable town if needed. Outdoor work if the weather held. Kitchen work if it didn't. Afternoons were for the smaller projects, the mending pile that never fully emptied. Planning ahead, the accounts and the lists and the 100 small calculations that running a household required. She had started teaching Samuel to read numbers. He could read words already. He'd told her this with some pride, but numbers were different, he said. She thought he was right. And she spent 30 minutes with him 3 afternoons a week, working through the principles of basic bookkeeping with the ranch accounts as their textbook. It was practical, which he responded to. He didn't like learning things in the abstract. Wyatt noticed. He came in from outside one afternoon and found them at the kitchen table with the accounts open between them, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before making his presence known. She heard him and turned. "I can come back," he said. "We're almost done," she said. 5 minutes. He waited by the door without coming in or leaving, and when she finished with Samuel and sent him to feed the chickens, a task that had become Eli's domain but required supervision, she looked at Wyatt and said, "Do you want to sit down?" He came to the table and sat in the chair Samuel had just vacated. He looked at the accounts. He looked at them with the expression of someone who had known they existed and had felt responsible for them without understanding them. He any good? He asked. Meaning Samuel, he's quick. He'll be good. You're teaching him properly. I'm trying. He was quiet. Then, with the particular difficulty of a person who has decided to say something he's been holding for a while, I should know this. The accounts. I've been the one these past 2 years. I've been the one running things. But the money part, the ledger, I never kept that. Do you want to learn it? He looked at the ledger. Yeah, he said, I do. She got up and poured 2 cups of coffee, came back to the table, set one in front of him, and sat back down. All right, she said. Let's start from the beginning. They spent an hour on it. He was slower than Samuel he'd been working. Since he was 14, and his relationship to learning things at a table was not natural, but he was methodical, and he didn't pretend to understand things he didn't, which she respected. By the time the light outside had gone gray, and she needed to start supper, he could read the basic structure of the ledger and understood what the March number meant. He closed it when they finished. He sat back in his chair and looked at the table for a moment. When you showed up, he said, I thought you were going to last 2 weeks. I know I wasn't kind about it. No, she said. You weren't. He absorbed that. He didn't rush to excuse it. I thought if I made it hard enough, you'd decide it wasn't worth it. He paused. The other 2 I did the same thing. It worked. Why are you telling me this? He thought. Because I think you should know that it was deliberate and that I was wrong. She looked at him, this 19-year-old, who had held 7 children and a broken ranch together for a year with his bare will, and then deployed that same will against her, and who was now sitting at the kitchen table, telling her the truth about it. I know it was deliberate, she said. I knew by the 2nd day, and you stayed anyway. I told your father I would. He was quiet for a moment. That's the only reason? She considered the honest answer. No, she said, not the only one. He nodded. He stood and picked up his coffee and drank the last of it. He set the cup in the basin. He was almost to the door when he stopped. The bread this morning was better than yesterday's, he said. I don't know if you changed something. I let it proof longer. The kitchen runs cold in the mornings now. Right. He stood there a second. Good. He went out. She turned to the stove and started on supper, and she was very careful not to make too much of a small thing that was quietly not small at all. The letter from the Rollins mill came back in 10 days. They were interested. The timber price they offered was not generous, it rarely was, at distance, but it was real. And when she and Gideon sat down with it, and the accounts that night moved the March number from concerning to manageable, if the hay sale to the Booths went through. She had spoken to Agnes Booth in town the previous week. Agnes had the directness of a woman who had farmed long enough to know that sentiment was expensive, and she'd looked at the hay situation with the same clear-eyed calculation and said, yes, she'd take what the Mercers could spare, and she'd named a price that was fair. You've got yourself a network, Gideon said, looking at the numbers. Agnes is practical. Practical people are useful to know. You introduced yourself to her at the gathering. She introduced herself to me. I just didn't walk away. He looked at her. Most people in that hall, they were watching you, waiting to see what you'd do when Rosalie, he stopped. I should have done something sooner. About Rosalie. I let it go on too long. You couldn't have anticipated the gathering. I should have made something clearer before that. He was looking at the table, not at her. She, after Margaret died, her father brought her by twice. I wasn't in any place to be having those conversations, and I wasn't direct enough about it. I should have been. Why weren't you? He was quiet. Because I felt I owed something to the town. Owed the Vanus something. Edmund Vane extended me credit on the timber supplies we needed the winter Margaret died. He stopped. Started again. I was in debt in more than one way. That's a real thing, she said. The debt isn't just money. No. He looked up. But I let the social debt keep me from being honest with Rosalie, and she built something out of the ambiguity that I should have closed down earlier. And you paid for it. She looked at him. I can manage Rosalie Vane. I know you can. He said it without question. I've seen you manage a great deal harder things. He paused. What I said at the gathering in the yard. I want you to know I didn't say it for the audience. I said it because it needed to be said. She was quiet for a moment. I know, did it? He stopped. He was not a man who found these sentences easy. He could see the effort. Did it help or make it worse? Having someone else step in. It was such an honest question, and so unexpectedly considerate that she sat with it for a moment before answering. It helped, she said. I wasn't expecting it, no. I'm not used to someone. She stopped herself, started again more carefully. I've been taking care of things myself for a long time. I don't always know how to account for someone else in the calculation. He looked at her steadily. Neither do I, he said. Kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind pushed against the window, and the fire in the stove made its small sounds, and the lamp on the table threw its small circle of light. The accounts look better, she said. They do. We should write to the bank before the end of the month. Tell them the March payment is on track. All right. Better to communicate early than to let them wonder. I know. He paused. I've been learning that recently. She looked at him. He was looking at the ledger, but the expression on his face was not about the ledger. She stood and cleared the coffee cups and didn't say anything else, because some moments were complete without adding to them. The thing that changed the texture of everything came on a Thursday evening in the third week of November, and it came not from any dramatic event, but from a storm. The storm arrived from the northwest in the afternoon. With the speed that Wyoming storms had 1 hour, the sky was pale and flat. The next it was the color of a bruise and moving fast. Gideon and the older boys got the livestock secured before the worst of it. Evelyn got the shutters latched and the water barrel filled inside, and the extra wood stacked near the stove. And then the storm hit, and they were all inside, all 9 of them, for the first time, with nowhere else to go. It lasted 2 days. By the second morning, Evelyn understood something about confined spaces that she hadn't fully reckoned with. They either broke people or built them, and the difference was mostly in what you did with the time. Cooked. She had enough stores, she'd been building them systematically for weeks, and she used the time to make things that required attention, a proper beef stew with the last of the dried herbs, cornbread in the cast iron, a rice pudding that used the last of the precious sugar reserve, and that she made because Eli had mentioned rice pudding twice in passing, and she thought a storm was as good an occasion as any. The boys settled into the storm the way boys do, with initial energy that had to be redirected. She put the twins to splitting kindling inside when they started wrestling near the lamp. She gave Noah a project involving measuring and recoiling the rope stores, which absorbed him for most of a morning. Samuel read. Thomas and Wyatt played cards at the kitchen table with an intensity that suggested a long-standing competitive history. Gideon disappeared to the barn twice to check on the livestock and came back both times cold and wet and not in distress, which told her the animals were holding. The third time, she handed him a dry shirt and a cup of hot coffee before he could say anything, and he looked at her with surprise that had something almost rueful in it, the expression of a man not yet fully accustomed to being anticipated. On the second evening, when the storm had exhausted most of its worst energy and settled into steady snow, the boys were gathered in the main room. The lamp was lit. Gideon was in his chair by the fire. Evelyn's sat at the far end of the room with her mending, close enough to be part of the room without being at the center of it. Silent Thomas, who had been giving her gradually increasing degrees of acknowledgement for weeks, looked up from his cards and said, without particular build-up, "Tell us something." She looked up. "What a story Ma used to." He stopped. He glanced at his father. Gideon's face was still. "She used to tell stories on long nights," Wyatt said. He said it the same way Thomas had, plainly, without drama, but with a weight behind it. Evelyn was aware of the room. All 7 boys in some configuration of attention, Eli already with his head tilted, Samuel's book down in his lap, even Noah watching from his position near the stove. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't interpret, not quite asking, not quite warning. something between. I'm not sure I tell them the same way your mother did, she said. Probably not, Wyatt said. That's all right. So she told a story. It was not a romantic story or a clever story. It was a story her aunt had told her about a woman who came to a new place and didn't know anyone and had to learn the land from scratch. And it was the kind of story where the problems were real and the solutions were practical and the ending was not perfect but was honestly earned. She told it in the same voice she used for everything plain, without decoration, letting the true parts be true. When she finished, the room was quiet in the way that rooms are after a story, when people are stills inside it. Eli said, "Did she stay, the woman in the story?" "She stayed," Evelyn said. "Did she get to be happy?" She thought about her aunt the way she'd looked in her kitchen at 70 with her worn hands and her full pantry and her particular stubborn satisfaction. "I think she got to be useful," she said, which was what she wanted. Eli thought about this. "That's like you," he said. The room was quiet again. She looked down at her mending. "It's late," she said. "Time for bed." They went not immediately, not without the usual negotiation and delay that 7 boys produced, but they went. And when the room had emptied, Gideon was still in his chair by the fire, and she was still at the far end of the room with her mending, and the storm outside had softened to a steady, quiet snow. He said, "You handled that well. It's just a story." "It's not just a story." He was looking at the fire. Eli said something true. She kept her eyes on the mending. "You came here with 1 bag," he said, "no one to speak for you, into a house that was in no condition to receive anyone." He paused. "And you just got to work." He looked at her. "I've been trying to figure out if I should say something about that, if it needed saying." "It doesn't need saying." "No," he agreed, "but I want to say it anyway." He looked back at the fire. "Thank you." She put the mending down. She looked at him, the angle of his jaw, the lines around his eyes that had everything and nothing to do with years outdoors. Particular tiredness of a man who had been carrying something too long. "Tell me about her," she said. He looked at her. "Margaret," she said. "Tell me about her. Not about losing her. About her." The silence stretched. She thought he might refuse, might close back down into the careful, sealed version of himself that managed everything from behind its walls. Then he began. He talked for a long time, not fluidly, not in the practiced way of someone who's told a story many times in the halting, recalibrating way of a person, pulling something up from a depth they don't visit often. Margaret had grown up in Nebraska, the second of 4 sisters. She had a temper that came and went quickly, which was where Wyatt had gotten his. She had been the one who'd planned the garden, who'd put up the preserves, who'd known instinctively that the kitchen was the center of the house and had built from there. She had been funny, privately funny dry, in a way that surprised people who'd expected a farmer's wife to be only earnest. But she had loved Wyoming with a specific stubborn love that came from choosing it deliberately and meaning the choice. He talked about the last year of her illness, which he did briefly and without much detail, but he didn't avoid it. He talked about the morning after she died, when he'd had to figure out how to explain it to Evelyn, who was 5 and didn't yet have the capacity to hold permanent things. Wyatt took Eli outside, he said. He walked him around the whole property. 2 hours. He came back and Eli was not better but steadier. He'd shown him everything that was still there. He stopped. I didn't ask him to do that. He knew. "That's when you knew he was going to be all right," she said. "Yes." He was quiet. "I wasn't sure about the others." Thomas went silent for months. Noah, he shook his head. "Noah hasn't been entirely himself since. He's better. But there's a piece of him that's still waiting to see if it's safe," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, that's exactly it." She looked at the fire. "He's been watching me," she said. "Noah. He watches everything. He's measuring how long things last." "Yes, I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, does that bother you? Being measured like that?" "No," she said. "I'd rather be measured honestly than accepted without question." She paused. "He'll come to his own conclusion in his own time. I just have to still be here when he does." Gideon looked at her with an expression she had no name for. It wasn't gratitude. She was starting to recognize gratitude on his face. And this was something different. It had more weight to it. It sat differently. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. When you came here, the arrangement we discussed in the letters. A roof, honest work. That's what we agreed. Still, is that what you want? Is that enough?" She looked at him directly. She understood what he was actually asking, and she understood that it had cost him something to ask it in those terms, indirect enough to be retractable, but clear enough to mean something if she chose to receive it that way. "I don't know," she said, which was the truth. "I know that I don't want to leave. I know that this," she gestured vaguely at the house, the kitchen, the empty room where 7 boys had just been. "This feels like something real. I know I want to see it through." "That's an honest answer," he said. "It's the only one I've got right now." He nodded. He looked at the fire. "That's enough," he said. For now, she picked up her mending. The fire burned. The snow outside had gone from heavy to light, the kind that fell almost silently, and the house was warm and dark and full of sleeping boys, and neither of them felt the need to fill the rest of the evening with words. December arrived, and with it a shift in the town's temperature toward the Mercer household that Evelyn noticed gradually, then, all at once, started small. Agnes Booth stopped by with extra salt and a jar of venison she'd put up, and said that her husband had sent over 2 lengths of good rope, which he thought the Mercers might use. The way she said it, without explanation, without ceremony, made it clear it wasn't charity. It was the particular exchange of practical people who have decided to be in each other's orbit. Then the postmaster's wife, a woman named Ruth Harding, who had been cautiously friendly at the gathering, came by with the pattern for children's winter socks and asked if Evelyn could use it, because she had too many patterns and not enough time. Evelyn could use it and said so, and Ruth Harding stayed for coffee and talked about the county. The way a woman talks to someone she has decided is worth the information. Then Clara Whitfield, the young woman from the gathering with the baby on her hip, appeared one afternoon with her husband, and a request. Could Evelyn teach Clarcia how to put up preserves properly? She'd been doing it wrong, she said without apology. She'd lost 3 jars to mold last summer, and she didn't want to lose more. Evelyn taught her. Clara came twice more that month, and by the 3rd visit had brought a friend. And the kitchen on those afternoons had more people in it than it had probably had since Margaret was alive. Gideon noted this without comment. Wyatt noticed too. She caught him watching one afternoon from the doorway, when 3 women were working in the kitchen alongside Evelyn. And his expression was the one he wore when he was recalibrating something. What had happened at the harvest gathering had moved through the community in the way that significant moments do not dramatically, not all at once, but as a piece of information that people filed and returned to. Gideon speaking in the yard had been seen by people who told it to people who hadn't seen it, and the version that traveled was the true one, a man standing up publicly for a woman who had come to his family with nothing and was building something real. Rosalie Vane's name came up less. When it did, it came up in a different way less, as the center of the social conversation and more as a reference point, and not a favorable one. Evelyn did not track this with any satisfaction. She was too busy for satisfaction. The winter stores needed one more round of assessment. The chicken coop was producing eggs not reliably, because December light was poor and hens were particular, but enough to matter. The letter to the bank had been sent, and a reply received that was professionally warm in the way that bankers were when they believed they were going to be paid. And Noah had started talking to her, not extensively, not with the open current of Eli, or the strategic intelligence of Samuel, or even the slow, careful revelations of Thomas. But he had started talking, which was different from where they'd been. It had begun with a question about the chickens, specifically about the dominant hen that Eli had named first, which was not a name anyone else used, but which had stuck. Noah had come to the coop one morning and stood outside it and watched, first navigate the hierarchy with her particular brand of bossy efficiency, and he'd said, without looking at Evelyn, "Why does she get to be in charge?" "She decided to be," Evelyn said, "and she hasn't backed down." he'd thought about this. Then he'd gone inside and done his morning chores without another word. But the following morning he came to the coop again. And the morning after that, and the question he asked, that third morning was nothing about chickens. "Did you have brothers and sisters?" he said. "No," she said. "Just me, so you were alone." "Not always. I had my aunt, but no family of your own." She looked at him. He was watching First move around the coop with his particular focused observation. "No," she said, "not until now." He was quiet for a long moment. First did something to a smaller hen that required brief arbitration, and they both watched. "Okay," he said, and walked away. She stood by the coop for a moment in the cold morning air. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that could be dismissed a 9-year-old asking a question and walking away, nothing more. But she had learned, in the weeks she had been here, to understand what the small things actually were. They were evidence. They were the accumulation of evidence that something was changing, had been changing, was continuing to change in the slow and uneven and genuine way that things changed when they were real. She checked on the hens and went back inside to start breakfast. And the morning was cold and clear and ordinary, and the house smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the faint, good smell of yesterday's bread. And she moved through it the way she had started to move through all of it, not as a stranger finding her footing, not as a woman managing an arrangement, but as a person in a place that was, cautiously and incompletely and honestly, beginning to be hers. The bank letter came on a Friday in the first week of March, and Evelyn was the one who brought it in from the post. She had gone to town alone, the way she did most Fridays, now a trip that had started as necessity and had become something she valued for its own reasons. Carey Springs in winter was a different place than it had been in October. Cold stripped away the social performance of warmer months and left something more honest. People spoke more directly. They helped each other more visibly because the cost of not helping was higher and everyone could see it. She collected the post from Ruth Harding, who had become genuinely friendly in the way that some people became when you gave them enough time to make up their own minds. Ruth handed her 3 items a seed catalog Evelyn had sent away for, a letter from the Rawlins mill confirming the final timber payment, and the envelope from the bank in Cheyenne with its careful printed return address. She did not open it in the post office. She put it in her coat pocket and drove home with it sitting against her ribs like a held breath. Gideon was in the barn when she got back. She found him there repairing a piece of harness with the focused attention he brought to all such work, and she stood in them barn doorway and held out the envelope. He looked at it. He set down the harness. He opened the letter with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has decided that whatever the letter says, he will read it standing up and steady. She watched his eyes move across the page. She watched his jaw. She had learned to read Gideon Mercer in the months she'd been here, not completely, not in the deep way of people who have decades of shared context, but enough. Enough to know that the slight release in the muscles around his eyes meant the news was not bad. He handed her the letter. She read it. The bank acknowledged receipt of the March payment in full. The note was current. The account was in good standing. She read it twice, which was not because she hadn't understood it the first time, but because she wanted to be sure it was real. The timber sale made up the difference, she said, and the hay. He took the letter back and folded it, and the reduced spending. All of it, she said, all of it together. He nodded. He put the letter in his shirt pocket where he kept important things, and he picked up the harness, and he went back to work. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment longer and looked at the way the March light came through the high window and fell across the hay and thought about the ledger she had first opened, 5 months ago, the numbers that had looked, on that first night, like a wall. They had turned out to be a problem. Problems had paths through them. She had said that then, and it had been true. She went back to the kitchen and started on the bread. And when Eli came in from the coop with his egg report, 7 eggs, "Good morning," she told him. The bank letter had come, and it was good news, and he said, "So we keep the ranch?" with the directness of a child who cuts to the only question that actually matters. And she said, We keep the ranch." And he put his eggs down carefully and hugged her around the middle with the uncomplicated force of a 6-year-old who has just heard something important, and she put her hand briefly on the back of his head and let him. It was Wyatt who brought her the question she hadn't known she was waiting for. Came to her on a Sunday afternoon in mid-March, when the snow was finally doing something different, not disappearing. Not yet, but settling into the particular exhausted flatness that meant winter was losing its conviction. He found her in the garden, which had become a habit. She went out there in the afternoons to walk the beds and think about spring. Cold frame on the east end was repaired. Now Thomas had done it, quietly, one afternoon in January without being asked, and she had thanked him, and he had shrugged, and that had been that. Wyatt came and stood at the garden edge, with his hands in his pockets, which was his thinking posture. "Pa wants to talk to you tonight," he said. After supper, she looked up at him. "All right." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the garden beds, the repaired cold frame, the cleared paths between them. He looked at all of it the way a person looks at a thing they have started to see differently. "I've been thinking," he said, "about next spring. The garden." He paused. "I could build a second cold frame on the west end. If the east one works the way you're planning." She looked at him. "That would extend the season by another 2 weeks. Maybe 3. I know. I looked it up. In one of Ma's books." He said it without particular weight, but it had weight anyway that he had gone to his mother's books, that he had looked something up for a future he was starting to imagine. She had a book on kitchen farming in the chest upstairs. "I didn't know about the book. I found it last month." He was quiet again. "You can have it if you want. It'd be more useful to you." She understood what he was giving her. Not just the book, the permission that came with it, the acknowledgement that she was the one who would carry this garden forward, and that he was all right with that now. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He started back toward the house, then stopped. "He's been working up to this for a while," he said. "Whatever he wants to say tonight. I just thought you should know. Thank you for telling me." He walked back to the house without looking back, and she stood in the garden in the flat March light and thought about that, and then she went back to thinking about the beds. Supper that evening was louder than usual. The twins had reached some kind of détente with Noah over a dispute that had been running for 2 weeks, and the resolution of it involving a trade of tasks that neither of them fully explained had restored a general goodwill to the table. Samuels had something to report about first. The dominant hen, who had apparently organized a territorial dispute with decisive efficiency that he felt deserved recognition. Even Thomas contributed 2 full sentences unprompted, which was, by Thomas standards, a speech. Evelyn made stewed chicken and biscuits, real biscuits, the kind that had become a reliable feature of the household, the kind the boys no longer commented on because they had stopped being notable and started being simply what biscuits were. That was how she knew something had taken root, when it stopped being remarkable. She ate and listened and did not say much, which was not unusual. She had found her position at this table not at the center of it, not as its performance, but as part of its structure. The table worked because everyone had a place in it, and she had found hers. After the boys had cleared a task that had been distributed among them by some negotiation that she hadn't imposed and that had simply appeared over the winter, Gideon said to them, collectively, "Give us a few minutes." The request was so simple and so direct that it worked without argument. The boys dispersed with the practiced ease of people who have learned to read a room. Wyatt took Eli upstairs without being asked. The twins went to the barn for evening chores that were probably done already. Thomas and Samuel and Noah found their own directions, and within 5 minutes the kitchen was empty except for the 2 of them. Gideon sat across from her. He had his coffee, which had been a fixture of every significant conversation they'd had, and she thought distantly that coffee was the language he reached for when he needed to talk about something real. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this right," he said. "I've been working on it for a while." "I know," she said. "Wyatt told me." He looked at her with a flicker of something she thought it might have been almost amusement. "Of course he did. He thought I should be prepared. He's not wrong. He looked at his coffee, then at her. When I put that advertisement in the paper last year, in the spring I knew what I was asking for. Someone capable. Someone who could manage the house and the boys and not fall apart in the first month. He paused. I didn't think about anything beyond that. I wasn't in a place to think beyond that. She waited. And then you came, he said. And you were exactly what I'd asked for. Capable. Not falling apart. He stopped. But you were also more than I'd accounted for. And I didn't know what to do with that. At first, he looked at her directly. I don't think I handled it well, early on. I was too. I kept you at a distance, and you let me. And I think we both told ourselves that was the appropriate arrangement. It was what we agreed, she said. It was, he said. But it stopped being enough. For me. And I think he paused. I think it may have stopped being enough for you, too. I don't want to put words in your mouth. She looked at him. She thought about all the moments she had filed and set aside and told herself were simply the product of proximity and shared circumstance. The lamp-lit conversations over the ledger, the storm and the story, and the fire burning low. The morning he'd handed her the bank letter, and the way something had moved through the air between them in the barn doorway that she had not named. No, she said quietly. You're not putting words in my mouth. He set his coffee down. I know this isn't a simple situation. I know what you came from, and I know what you agreed to, and I know that what I'm asking, if I ask it, is asking you to change the terms. He looked at his hands. I have 7 boys in a ranch with a repaired debt and a chicken coop and a garden that's going to need a second cold frame. He looked up. I have a great deal to offer you that isn't simple or easy or uncomplicated. I know that, she said. I'm not asking you to stay because the ranch needs a housekeeper, he said. I'm not asking because the boys need someone to cook for them. He met her eyes. I'm asking because I choose to ask, because I have been watching you hold this family together for 5 months, and because he stopped, because you made this place feel like it was worth staying for, and I want you to stay, not for the work, for yourself, because this is where you belong. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the first real suggestion of spring, a loosening in the air, a giving up in the cold, moved against the window. She looked at Gideon Mercer. This worn, careful, difficult man who had taken 6 months to say something he'd probably known for 4, who had handed her a broken ledger and a grief-hollowed house and 7 complicated boys, and had watched, without fully allowing himself to hope, while she found her way into every corner of it. She had spent her whole life being valued for what she could do, what her hands could produce, what her skills could fix. She had built her identity around that, around capability, around usefulness, around never needing anything that she couldn't provide for herself. It was armor that had served her well and cost her more than she had admitted. You should know something, she said. I came here because I had no better option. That's the truth. I came here without expectations and without the kind of hope that most women bring to something like this. She looked at him steadily. I spent the first 2 weeks waiting to fail. I spent the next 2 weeks deciding I wouldn't. And somewhere between then and now, she stopped. Somewhere between then and now, this stopped being a place I was managing and started being a place I was living in. Yes, he said. That happened because of the boys, she said. Because of Eli and the chickens and Samuel and the accounts and Noah by the coop asking me questions. Because of Wyatt and the bread and Thomas fixing the cold frame without saying anything about it. She paused. And because of you, the ledger, the barn, the harvest gathering. She looked at him. Because you are also more than I accounted for. He was very still. Yes, she said. I'll stay. Not because of the work. Not because there's nowhere else to go. She held his eyes. Because I choose to. He reached across the table not dramatically, just steadily, and put his hand over hers. It was a plain gesture from a plain man, and it was exactly right. They sat there for a moment, both of them, in the kitchen that she had stripped and scrubbed and rebuilt from almost nothing, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that only grows between people who have been through something real together. The wedding happened in April. Not a large affair, not a thing with much ceremony or decoration, or anything that required resources the ranch didn't have. Agnes Booth came, and Clara Whitfield and her husband, and Ruth Harding from the post office, and a few of the neighboring ranching families who had been folding into the Mercer orbit over the winter months. The Justice of the Peace from Cary Springs drove out to the ranch, which he had done before, and seemed to find uncomplicated. The boys stood in a row on the porch, the way they had stood on the porch the day she arrived, but the quality of it was entirely different. Eli had combed his hair with water, which had held for approximately 10 minutes before reverting. Samuel had found his good shirt and was wearing it with obvious self-satisfaction. The twins stood shoulder to shoulder with the expressions of boys who have reached a consensus on approving something. Thomas had polished his boots, which nobody had asked him to do. Noah stood next to Wyatt with his arms at his sides and his face very composed, and when she came out of the house and stood on the porch, he looked at her with the direct, measuring look he'd been developing all winter, and then he gave her a small, deliberate nod. One nod. Held for a full second. She received it like the significant thing it was. Wyatt stood at the end of the row closest to his father. He was wearing his good jacket, and his jaw was set in the way it set when he was keeping himself from showing what he felt. When the Justice of the Peace said what needed to be said and Gideon put the ring on her hand, a plain band worn smooth, which had been his mother's, Wyatt looked at the middle distance and swallowed once and was stills. After, when it was done, and the small company was eating at the long table they'd set up outside, because April had finally turned warm enough, Wyatt came and stood beside her, where she was talking with Agnes Booth. He waited until Agnes had moved on, and then he said, very quietly, "Welcome to the family," officially. It was not an elaborate thing to say, but from Wyatt, who had stood in a kitchen doorway 5 months ago and told her that 2 women had already fled and watched, to see what she would do with that information from him. It was as full a welcome as she had ever received from anyone. "Thank you," she said. "Don't make me say it again," he said. "I'll only mean it once." "I know," she said. Once was enough. The months that followed did not resolve into anything that looked like perfect. The second cold frame went up in May. It worked. Mostly there was a problem with the east-facing boards warping in the June heat that required rethinking, and Wyatt and Evelyn spent 3 afternoons arguing about the solution before arriving at a modification that neither of them had come up with alone. She had been right about the structural issue. He had been right about the material. They had been wrong together, first, which was how most useful things got figured out. The hens continued to produce with the inconsistency of hens. First maintained her authority over the flock with undiminished ruthlessness. Eli considered this correct and appropriate. Noah had begun helping with the coop without being asked, and somewhere in the process of feeding and cleaning and watching the daily dramas of 12 chickens, some of the waiting quality had gone out of him, not entirely, not all at once, but enough that Evelyn could see the difference in the way he sat at the table. He took up more space. He laughed more readily. He was, she thought, slowly learning that things could last. Thomas had said 17 things at supper in June that counted as voluntary contributions to the conversation, which she had not tracked intentionally but had noticed. He was reading more. She had found him twice with books from a small stack she'd quietly left near the lamp, books she'd sourced from Ruth Harding and Agnes Booth and Clara Whitfield over the spring months. He hadn't mentioned them, and she hadn't mentioned them. Some things worked better, as an arrangement between people who both understood what was happening and declined to make it awkward. The twins turned 15 in July and demanded a fishing expedition that turned into a full-day project involving all 7 boys and Gideon, and came home with, collectively, 4 fish and a great deal of mud, and the kind of communal satisfaction that couldn't be planned. She had made fish chowder from the 4 fish, which required supplementing substantially with stored ingredients, and had said nothing about the ratio of effort to catch. Samuel could read the accounts without assistance by August. He was faster than Wyatt now, which Wyatt acknowledged with the equanimity of a 19-year-old who had decided to find this funny rather than wounding. They had started, without anyone deciding they would, a kind of division. Wyatt managed the outdoor accounts, the livestock, the supply negotiations. Samuel tracked the kitchen and household numbers and reported them in the weekly summary that Evelyn had instituted in January, and that had become simply part of how the ranch ran. The garden that summer was real. She had planned it through the winter from Margaret's book, and from her own knowledge, and from a long conversation with Agnes Booth about what actually grew in that soils, in that climate, which differed in important ways from what the optimistic gardening book suggested. The tomatoes came in August big, imperfect, sun-cracked at the shoulders, the kind that tasted like what tomatoes were, before anyone had bred the wildness out of them. Eli ate one standing in the garden before she could slice it, and the juice ran down his chin, and he looked at her with an expression that had no words in it, but said everything about what it meant for a 6-year-old to eat a tomato from a garden that existed because someone had decided to plant one. She thought about what she had said to him. Back in October, I'm planning next spring, and about the way he had looked at her when she said it, trying to understand whether she meant it. She had meant it. And now it was summer, and there were tomatoes. There was a moment in late August, one of those evenings that summer produces when it's trying to remind you what it can do, before it lets go, when Evelyn sat on the porch after supper and watched the light go horizontal across the pasture and thought about who she had been when she had stepped off that stagecoach 11 months ago. She had come here with one bag and a contract and the specific hollowness of a person who had so long being useful that she had forgotten to notice whether she was happy. She had come here believing, in the quiet and unexamined place where people keep their truest beliefs, that she was worth exactly what she could produce, that her value lived in her hands, that love, real love, chosen love was something that happened to people whose lives had been arranged differently than hers. She had been wrong. Not entirely, not in the simple way of a person who had been deceived. She had been wrong in the way that people are wrong when they've built their whole structure on a premise that they accepted too young and never examined. Usefulness was real. Work was real. The bread and the ledger and the garden were all real and mattered. But they were not the whole of what she was, and they were not the reason she had been chosen. Gideon came out and sat beside her. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He had learned, over the months, that she thought out loud when she was ready and didn't when she wasn't, and that both were fine. They sat in the evening quiet, and below, in the yard, she could hear the boys in their various occupations, Eli and Noah, in some complicated game that involved the fence posts and a stick, the twins arguing about something with the cheerful energy of people who enjoy arguing. Thomas's voice, somewhere calm and dry, providing a remark that made someone laugh. "What are you thinking about?" Gideon asked. He asked it not as a demand for access, but as a simple, genuine question. "That I almost didn't come," she said. He looked at her. "After I sent the first letter," she said, "I had a week where I thought about not sending the second one. About finding a different situation." She paused. "I had a position offered to me in Columbus. Housekeeper for a family with 2 children. Clean house. Regular wage. Nothing complicated. Why didn't you take it?" Thought about this honestly. "Because the advertisement you wrote was honest," she said. "It didn't promise anything it couldn't deliver. It just said what was there and asked who could handle it." She looked at the pasture. "I've been lied to with pretty language often enough to know the difference." "Yours didn't have any." He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't trying to be appealing. I know, that's why it worked." He looked at the yard where Eli had apparently won whatever the game was and was conducting a modest victory that Noah was tolerating with visible effort. "I was afraid," Gideon said, after the second woman left. "I thought I'd made the wrong decision trying this at all, that the boys would be better served by just managing alone until they were older." "You were wrong about that." "Yes." He paused. "Wyatt told me the same thing, actually. In February," he said. He stopped. "He said that the ranch didn't need someone to manage it. It needed someone to live in it. She looked at him. When did he say that? One evening when I was working up to this, he gestured vaguely at the general fact of their marriage, their life, the porch they were sitting on. He was more direct about it than I expected. He's more perceptive than he lets on. He always has been. He was quiet for a moment. He's going to be fine. All of them are going to be fine. She believed that. She had believed it in pieces for months, and now she believed it whole. Not because the hard things were done. The hard things were not done. They would never be entirely done. Because that was simply the truth of a life with 7 children and a working ranch and land that required constant attention. But because the boys had learned something over the winter and spring and summer that couldn't be unlearned. They had learned what it felt like when the house was a home. They had learned what it meant to sit at a table that was stable and warm and honest. They had learned that structures could be rebuilt from almost nothing if the person doing the building was to start with what was there. Noah had learned that things could last. Wyatt had learned that asking for help was not the same as failure. Thomas had learned that silence was a choice, not a requirement. Eli had learned that planting something meant believing in the future, and that believing in the future was allowed. And she had learned, was still learning, would probably be learning for the rest of her life, that being loved for who you are and being valued for what you do were not the same thing, and that only one of them was worth building a life around. She had come here with one bag and no expectations, and the quiet, worn belief that she was a pair of capable hands and nothing more. She was still capable. She was still useful. She still got up before light and built the fire and ran the kitchen with the same practical intelligence she had always had. But she was also Evelyn Mercer, on her own porch, watching her family in the evening light of an August that had been warm and real and imperfect and genuinely, stubbornly, honestly hers. That wasn't enough. More than enough. It was everything.